Hi, folks. We want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself while you're listening to the Whole Again podcast. Thanks.
Hey, this is Teddy, and welcome back to the Whole Again Pod, the podcast that states that we all, without exception, can be whole again.
And the only podcast that comes with a reason to buy fresh flowers.
No, literally just buy them. You should always have fresh flowers.
I think they bring you joy. They bring me joy anyway.
Just don't cut them out of someone else's yard. We've had people doing that lately. It's not cute.
Thank you all for being back with us. This is episode 4, so we're going to explore the fourth statement of the framework today. Trauma overwhelms. The full statement is trauma overwhelms our body-brain's ability to integrate and cope with a traumatic experience. So we're in the deep end of this, folks. If you're jumping in just now, welcome. And we recommend you check out the first couple of episodes. This episode will make a little bit more sense, have better context. But we're glad you're here anyway. Last episode, we talked about the third statement, trauma interrupts. Again, our goal in this framework is to focus on what trauma is and what healing can be.
A central premise of this episode is the concept of being overwhelmed.
And Teddy has given us a deep cut of what it means to be whelmed.
I mean, how do you not ask that question? I love to play with words, and so I had to get in there and start to wax poetic about what it is to be whelmed. And then it was a very short trip to finding out that literally whelmed just means overwhelmed. It actually, the dictionary definition is to be enveloped or submerged in liquid, right? And so the overwhelm is, just a little gilding the lily there. But what I appreciate about what it is to experience whelmedness or experience overwhelm is that it really does describe what it is to kind of be underwater, right? And for many folks who are trauma survivors, it is a pretty consistent description of what their experience is, right? This idea of being kind of underwater, or that when people talk about stress being kind of up to my neck or up to my eyeballs in whatever they're in, and that our nervous systems, which we'll talk about in a moment, experience stress and trauma in the same way, right? So it's the same system that's responding to stress as it is that is responding to trauma. And so the idea of being kind of underwater or gasping for air, submerged, like all of those narrative components, as Leslie describes, are kind of really great ways of talking about what it is to experience this. Maybe one more thing that I'll say, and then we'll get more specific, is people also sometimes talk about flooding. We'll link it in the show notes because I don't remember who really coined the term for what it is to be flooded and have our nervous system be flooded. But again, it gives us this sense of being overwhelmed, of drowning, of being too full of something, right? And that is often what we experience when our nervous system says like, yo, that's a wrap, like that's too much. So as a reminder from last episode, the definition of wellness that we use is really about being able to experience the fluid movement from calm and safe to adventure, adversity, risk, etc., and then come back. And so when we experience an interruption, it's that fluidity that's interrupted. It's our ability to move back to safety and calm. Again, if you want to keep it this water metaphor, it's like we've swam too far out and we actually can't get back to shore. When we're overwhelmed, we've gone just too far from safety and calm, or we've been away from it for too long to find our way back.
There is so much that we don't actually know about the brain. But let's talk about a couple of things that we do know about how this squishy organ in a lightless box is trying to get around. So the first thing that I want to say about this is to address this term body brain that we've been using, because I don't think we've actually really explained what that phrase is and why we're using it. In the education we received on trauma and in a lot of the ways that trauma is talked about in the mainstream, it's really a thing that's happening to your brain, right? Your brain is where your amygdala, or what I'll refer to as your survival brain, kind of goes off because it's having a threat or stress or trauma response. You have your prefrontal cortex, neocortex, what I'll call your thinking brain, and that's responsible for what we call executive functioning, right? So planning, taking the perspective of another person, looking at consequences, right? So you need, in order to do this executive functioning, you need access to that front brain. But the survival brain, right, your amygdala, is always, always, always scanning in the background, right? We inherited it. It is, it may be sloppy, it may be overreactive, but it is what has kept us alive and evolving for hundreds of thousands of years, right? So it's helped our species survive. It's the system we've got to work with. However, it is sort of a blunt instrument, right? If you're living in persistently traumatic conditions and your threat response system is going off all the time and your internal fire alarm gets pulled, all of the emergency responses get activated, right? Your heart rate increases, your digestion slows down, you can kind of focus in, get hyper focus. And what's happening is your survival brain is sending the message, right, that we have to run from the lion. So you get a little flood of adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine, and that happens in your body, right? It doesn't have, like, your brain is part of the scanning system, but when you talk about a gut reaction, when you think about what happens in your body when you go into a stress response, so think about a near miss in a car accident, or you almost missed that bottom stair and your stomach drops, right? It happens in your body. It doesn't your brain's part of it, but we really feel like we've severed the body brain. So our use of the term body brain is to really very out loud reconnect those two parts of us and say they're not separate. Like they're whole, and we can make them whole again. So that's where the term body brain comes from. It's really a language way to try to bring these two parts of ourselves back together.
So as we said before, right, we begin whole. And, our birthrights are safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And whether it's just a promise, whether it's an instant, whether it lasts for a long time or a lifetime, we understand that those fundamentals are our birthright. And then trauma interrupts, right? So we experience an assault on our safety, agency, dignity, or belonging, whether in that acute way, so like in that exact moment, or over several micro moments, one or more of our fundamentals begin to fracture. We begin to believe that they're not our birthright. And we may even begin trading them one for the other, right? This idea that if I'm not guaranteed this birthright, then I need to hold on to the ones that I've got. And also, if it's not guaranteed, then I might be able to trade or exchange it for something else, right? Like I might be able to trade some of my agency to stay safe. Again, I'm a Black dude walking around in this body. When I get pulled over by the police, like often it is my agency and sometimes my dignity that I'm willing to let go of so that I can make it home safe to my children, right? So that is what it is to be under that kind of persistently traumatic condition, right? If we talk about the persistently traumatic condition of racism and mass incarceration and over-policing, then in that moment when I encounter that system, I'm making an exchange, right, to ensure my survival. When our traumatic conditions persist unaddressed, right, our beliefs continue to shift. So if my fundamentals are not a birthright, then maybe yours aren't either, right? This world may be an inherently dangerous place. And so when we say trauma overwhelms, part of what we mean is that it outpaces our healing and exhausts our coping and our regulating or our co-regulating. We'll talk about this in terms of body-brain behavior because those are the ways that we think about what trauma is impacting and what we see. Often from the outside, we see behavior first. And so we might see a worldview in somebody where they say like, yo, the world is inherently dangerous. I have to be on guard all the time. And our nervous system tunes to that. It gets attuned for threat detection. It begins to sift for threat at all times. And it doesn't necessarily get good at differentiating something that's innocuous from something that's truly threatening. The backfiring of a car, being able to distinguish from the firing of a gun, being bumped in a way that's distracted from somebody versus in a way that's disrespectful or in a way that's an affront to my dignity, right? A nervous system that's tuned for threat detection can have that kind of hypervigilance, that always on alert, which overtaxes a nervous system that is built to kind of upswing, right? To activate, to peak, and then to come back down again. When we're under persistently traumatic conditions, what we experience is that our nervous system activates, peaks, and then stays there because we don't know when the threat is gone or the threat doesn't go anywhere. And so we have to be always on alert. One of the things that I used to see with young people that I would work with is that they would move from environments where that hypervigilance was really an asset, right? Where it actually did often keep them safe, into environments where that hypervigilance was no longer an asset, where it was more likely to get them into more trouble, right? So if you're moving from an environment where there's high levels of potential violence, and being on hypervigilance, being really alert to your surroundings is really helpful. And then you move into a place of relative peace, calm, safety, and you don't turn off that hypervigilance. There's not a way for you to get that kind of down regulated. Then when you're walking down the hallway and someone bumps your shoulder, right? Like that thing that is innocuous does feel like an assault. And so your nervous system, right? Not your thinking brain, right? Your nervous system says like, yo, that's a threat, respond quick. So before that person has even had the thought of, yo, that dude just bumped my shoulder, they're already in a fight or flight or freeze reaction inside of their body, inside of their nervous system, right? It's moving so much faster than thought. So you can have all of that disintegration.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Leslie.
I was just agreeing.
Yeah, tell him.
Yeah.
Right. But the fact is, right, that we can be whole again, right? We can put the fractures or disintegrated pieces, this kind of atomized agency or safety or belonging or dignity back together. One of the ways that we do that is to steep ourselves in spaces and in relationships where we get to experience and practice these fundamentals, where our sense of being inviolable can be restored, right? Where we can stand in and on our dignity, where we can have agency, make mistakes and make up for them, right? And move on. So I want us to think about trauma as overwhelm, yes, but also as kind of not destiny, right? Like it's a thing that happens, but it's not the last thing that happens necessarily, right? There's still, the reason that we call it the whole again pod, right? Like there's still the possibility of being whole again on the other side of it.
The body brain, it has a stress response system. It doesn't do a great job of differentiating between a bear chasing you and an unsent email. And you know how folks can call 911 and depending on the emergency, they'll send a different emergency vehicle? Well, our brain doesn't do that, right? It really doesn't differentiate between small stressors and large stressors, especially when people have been overexposed, especially when you are really wired for hypervigilance. So the way that our body brain learns, particularly how it adapts, there's a lot of what is referred to as neuroplasticity in the brain. One of the cool things about that is it means that our brains are actually changing and malleable and kind of evolving throughout most of our, at least well into our adult life. So the way that our brains adapt is through a process called degeneration. That's the fancy word for it. The cuter, funner way that people refer to this is the neurons that fire together wire together, which means that with small but repeated actions, right? If you're consistently putting together this stress response with this kind of regulation practice, eventually your body brain starts going, oh, when I feel the bear is running, I stop and do some square breathing because that's the best way for me to signal to my survival brain, there's not actually a bear. We don't have to run from the bear right now. And being able to breathe deeply is a really powerful intervention because it's the direct access to your respiratory system, which is in that same survival part of your brain, right? So there's not much in survival brain you have any control over. You don't have control over your heart rate. You don't have control over your digestive system. You can't, make your body's adrenaline or adrenal system work the way you want, right, with your mind. The one hack you have into your survival brain is your breath and how you regulate, slow, control your breathing. So it's a really powerful body-brain strategy. And there's so much more to say about the brain and how it evolves and changes over time in that kind of hypervigilance. But Teddy, do you want to talk about what the threat response system happens when it's in that kind of hypervigilance state?
For sure. So, I checked this a little bit earlier. Hypervigilance is that sense of kind of being always on alert, always ready for the next threat to come. And when I talk about this, I often talk about hypervigilance with its, cousin hypovigilance, because both of them can operate, and both of them are nervous system responses to those persistent traumatic conditions. So when we're talking about hypervigilance, this idea of being always on alert, always just one step away, always kind of ready, hyper being above, vigilance being kind of looking out for, we also can experience hypovigilance, right? So hyper being over, hypo being under. People talk about being hypoglycemic, right? If you've heard that term, right? So hypo. And it is the below the line. It's being numb to those threats. Sometimes another kind of sloppy way to talk about it is that above the line might be what people refer to as anxiety, and below the line might be what folks refer to as depression, right? So both of them can actually be similar nervous system states that manifest really different in terms of people's behavior. What's important to remember about them is that they're both doing their damnedest to keep us as safe as possible under the conditions that we're surviving, right? So whether someone is in that kind of always on alert stage, or whether someone is numb to or unaware of the threats or things that are coming their way, both of those are nervous system states that are about ensuring our safety. And it makes sense, right? If we think about it again narratively, if something is going to come and get me, if something is coming for me, if there's a danger out there and I don't know when it's going to hit and I don't know where it's coming from, my nervous system's like, yeah, we can either be always on the lookout for it, or we can be like, well, it's going to happen anyway and I don't have to bother, right? There's not a thing to do. So the reason that we talk about these as nervous system states versus like personality traits is that in that same way that Leslie was talking about, we kind of over-medicalize and over-individualize a lot of these conditions, it's that it's a nervous system state. It is both, what Leslie said, is not like I can actively control it with my mind necessarily, and it's also not personal, right? So while it might be individual in terms of being in my body versus in your body, it's not personal in the sense that it has anything to do with my actual personality, right? If that distinction makes sense. It is what my nervous system has learned to do in the state that my nervous system has been in. So when I talked a little bit earlier about like, oh, we got to steep ourselves in these spaces where we can experience relative calm, where we can experience belonging, where we can experience agency and safety, where we can practice dignity. We do that so that we can retune our nervous systems to experience that, to be tuned in for that, rather than its opposite. And that neuroplasticity is the thing that allows us to tune our nervous system in either way. I think maybe I'll say one or two last things. So one is when people talk about the window of tolerance, if people have heard that term, that is kind of being in between that hyper and hypo state. And one of the big things that people like to do in individual kind of therapeutic situations is to what people refer to as, expanding your window of tolerance. Like, what are the things that can come in to your field, to your system, that don't overwhelm you, right? That don't take you into hyper or hypo nervous system states, that are not as activating. When we think about that collectively, it's kind of the same thing, right? So how do we, as a group, and that group can be whatever you want it to be, right? So it can be your family, it could be your coworkers, it could be your organizing collective, right? How do you all experience new information? How do you experience things that might be dangerous or threatening? And be able to respond to those inputs in a way that continues to take care of the entirety of the collective body.
So our nervous systems are so complex, right? There is a lot that we still don't know about how they operate. But one of the things we know is that we do have these neurons, right, which is a type of cell, or one of the little teeny pieces that makes up your overall big brain, called mirror neurons. And what mirror neurons do is facilitate co-regulation, also kind of referred to as affect regulation, but we're just going to use the word co-regulation. Co-regulation is why babies like to play peekaboo, and why when you're driving and your loved one yawns, you yawn also. And the frequency with which you will repeatedly yawn after your loved one is connected to how close of a relationship you have with that person. We just instinctively have this wide range of nonverbal communication, which includes facial expression, body movement, like tone of voice, all sorts of things that communicate to the other people near us, right? So a lot of times when we're co-regulating with people, it's not necessarily about words, right? It's about our quality of presence. Resmaa Menakem says, settled bodies settle bodies. So when your quality of presence, when your body brain is settled, it is it becomes more possible, right? There's a pathway to healing for other people around to tune or to co-regulate to that quality of presence. So that's one strategy that we talk about. We instinctively do a lot of this with kids. Sometimes I think we instinctively do it with romantic partners. But the reality is this is not something that is lost to us once your kids become a certain age, right? Like, skin to skin contact, sitting quietly with people, 20-second hugs or 3-breath hugs. Like all of this has been shown with the science to reduce cortisol in people's bodies, right? And that is the stress cocktail, right? It literally does reduce your stress level to be outside in nature, to, be in the presence of people where you feel a sense of love and belonging, right? All of those things like decrease people's stress level. So those are all little bits on the pathways to healing, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But the idea that, trauma overwhelms and leaves us consistently exposed, right? When we are someone who is responding to, traumatic experiences or conditions. One of the many pathways to healing, one of the things that's consistently available to us is having people in our life that we can co-regulate with, right? Having people in our life that their mere presence like helps settle our body and helps attune. Like good therapy can do this. This is where I think therapy can be super great and helpful. But it's also, you can't only have one person that you co-regulate with or, is helping with your attunement that you see once every other week, right? And this is why the universal access to healing idea is so important, is because we all need to be able to be doing this better with our communities, our loved ones, our families, our people.
I don't know where this fits exactly, but I was thinking about it as you were talking about all the ways in which humans are herd animals. And the part of our brain that does the social and emotional work goes offline, right? When we're inside of a trauma response or a threat response or a threat reaction. And so in addition to not having access to like cognition and thinking and problem solving, right? Like we also don't have access to the parts of our brain that are really good at navigating social situations, emotionally regulating our bodies. And one of my favorite writers around this is Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote the book How Emotions Are Made. And she does this great read of this experiment that they had done with, shocking rats to induce, trauma responses and trauma reactions in them. And they kept trying to say that when this thing is happening, the rat or lab mouse or whatever is getting angry or is experiencing fear. But that's actually not what's happening. When she looked at the data, she was like, oh, that's not the fear center or the anger center or the anger print in the brain. It's actually the threat reaction part of the brain, right? So what's happening is that when the rats were in a corner and had the threat essentially in front of them, right, they exhibited what we would call a fight response, right? They were like, oh, I have to go through this threat in order to get to safety. When they were in the middle of the room or the little box, whatever, and there was an exit that was visible to them, they experienced a flight reaction, right? So their nervous systems were responsive to their current environment, which meant that when the nervous system said, we're in the middle of the room, there's a threat coming and there's nowhere to go, that they exhibited a freeze response. Not that they exhibited fear, right? Not that they were afraid, but that their nervous system knew that the safest thing to do in that moment was to stay really still and go nowhere, was not to show motion, which might activate, right, a predator, right? So again, like if we think about this in terms of, evolution over, thousands or millions of years, those are the things that are coded into our nervous systems, which is the things that helped all of us survive whatever conditions that we were under. So when our nervous system says like, yo, don't move, right? We don't move. Even if we're feeling really angry, right? Even if we're feeling really scared, even if we're feeling whatever we're feeling, we actually can't even tell what it is that we're feeling because that part of our brain is turned off. And that part of our body, the sensing part of our body that would even be aware of what those emotions are, is not getting attention. It's not getting time. Like Leslie said earlier, right? Like our digestion slows down. All of these things are happening. So in the midst of that threat reaction, our entire nervous system just says, yo, what's the quickest route for us to stay safe right now? And the problem is when those conditions do not abate, our nervous system doesn't know what to do. And so we just stay in that state for as long as it takes to get to some place of relative safety or calm. And that place might be really, really far away. So what it means to experience trauma as overwhelm isn't just this like peak moment of overwhelm. It is this persistent traumatic condition. It is being in that room with no exit and getting shocked over and over and over and over again. And our nervous system just being like, there is nothing to do but freeze, but immobilize, but stay still. And then we get stuck in that trauma reaction. And that trauma reaction gets stuck inside of us. And so what do we do with all this, right? So like, what's the point, right? Like, we're doing all this stuff. We're like body, brain, nervous system, blah, 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 right? Part of it is that we would like for everyone to know enough about this that they can clock it when it's happening, right? That I can have that experience and be like, oh, that's what's going on for me. When this person shows up in my classroom, in my neighborhood, in my house, when this relationship shows up, I have this reaction. That's really good information. We say this so that when you see other folks who are in that reaction, right? When you notice people who are your comrades and your loved ones who are in that fight or flight state, who are in that hyper or hypovigilance state, that you can find a way to help them co-regulate, right? That you can go and breathe with them. And you don't even have to look at them and be like, hey, I'm going to breathe with you, right? Again, hashtag humans are herd animals. You can literally just like sidle up and like breathe into your belly for whatever, 2 or 3 minutes and help their system down regulate.
And if I could add one thing to that around kind of managing our expectations in those moments.
Do it.
The other reality of people who are having a stress response, trauma response, or who are very escalated in some way is that nobody de-escalates from a 9 to a 2. Right? That's just not how. Oh, that's funny. Have you not heard me say that before?
I've not heard you say that before. No one. Well, because people talk about going from 0 to 60, and you're like, no one goes from 60 to 2. I'm like, oh, facts. That's a hard break, hard stop.
Facts. Yeah. And so, if the person that you're supporting is like an 8, they're really upset, they're really dysregulated, they're really angry, like whatever state it is they're in, there is literally nothing that you can say in one thing you can do or say that will take somebody from a 9 to a 2. And we can pressure test this by thinking for yourself, last time you were you were like storming, stomping, pacing around, and you were like laying out the angry story. Is there anything that anybody could say to you in that moment when you're that kind of upset that would bring you from a 9 to a 2? And I've asked that question to literally hundreds of people, and people laugh and say no, right? So I'm pretty sure this is a pretty universal response. So when we think about co-regulating and we think about how we're doing this attunement, right? We're thinking about like what micro moment can we have that's going to help this person, like eye contact, breathing, settling your body, small movements around the room, right? Like these are, instead of trying to figure out how do I help someone get from super, super upset to totally chill again, the question is, how do I think I can help support or be with this person to get from super, super upset to just super upset? And then from super upset to pretty upset still. And then from there to I can breathe a little deeper. I can move my body a little more. I can maybe start accessing my thinking brain and being able to take the perspective of another person. Another kind of little pressure test you can do on yourself is when you're really angry at another person. Like the source of your anger is that someone has done something that has really upset you. And someone says to you, well, what about their perspective? the majority of us will say when we're very angry, I don't care. I don't care what they think. I don't care, right? And the reality is we probably care very much. Like those are people usually we're so upset because we do care what they think, right? We do care about how they like look at the perspective. But when your survival brain is driving, when you are in that threat, stress, trauma response, you don't have access to the part of your brain that can take the perspective of another person. So when we say, I don't care, it's not actually that we don't care. It's that you can't access the part of your brain that can take the perspective of that other person, right? So you're really like just not like the part of your brain that's driving at that time is fight, flight, freeze, appease, right? And we've been kind of using a fight scenario, but it works just as the same with the other ones. So when we're thinking about supporting people who've experienced trauma and those that love them, right? Like the small steps, like how can I support this person or how can I support myself to get myself from a 9 to an 8 or an 8 to a 7 or 7 to a 6. All right. So as we kind of move towards the end of our episode, we do want to talk about overwhelm at the layers, right? So from the framework, both trauma and healing occur at 5 layers: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and or historical. And we're not going to go through overwhelm in detail at every single one of those layers. For more on that, check out the previous episodes. But it seems like a good time in the arc of history to talk about collective overwhelm. There's lots of feelings about this. I really want to focus in on what I have observed in a lot of different places as collective overwhelm. And from so many different people I know right after the election, when I would check in or just, see people, what I saw was freeze response. And I really think that there, for at least particularly, I think people who were Democratic, left, liberal leaning, there really was this like collective freeze response. I saw it again kind of across the board in different places, the way that, both pundits and podcasters and influencers and folks on social media were even talking about their reaction to it. And one of the things that we really want to call back from episode 2 is what is the connective tissue of a collective body, right? What is or of a system, right? What actually holds those systems, those collectives together? And it's the people that comprise them, right? So the relationships between people, the communications between people, right? This is people trying to sort out what comes next. And that is the moment in time that we're in right now. And at some point, other things will happen and we will have to, organize and mobilize and, figure out what we're going to do. But, when you look at everyone else around you and everyone's just like, stuck. And a bunch of people are doing that. That is really an example of a collective freeze response. And I think that's where we are as we close out 2024, looking at our country's future.
Thanks, Leslie. I think when I'm in this question around what's happening at the collective level or at the structural level at this particular moment, and what does the framework have to say about it, right? That I have to look in a few different places. I'm going to do something I often do in real life, but that I don't think I've done on the pod yet, which is pull from the book stack. So book DJ all day. And this is a piece from Liberated to the Bone by Susan Rafo. She's writing about how to adjust in the wake of harm and in the wake of violence, and this distinction between chiropractic work and craniosacral work. She says, long-term pain, stress, harm, or held injury means that our bodies have shaped themselves in response to this harm. And so this is not just about the way that 2 vertebrae are lined up or not lined up. It is about how the soft tissues hold shape around those 2 vertebrae. It's not just the 2 vertebrae. It's how the entire body exists in relationship to the pattern of those 2 vertebrae. Patterns that may have been there for years or sometimes generations. its internal memory, culture. With those two vertebrae that have been in one kind of shape for the last bunch of years, if you go in and adjust those bones to what you think their alignment should be, then over time, the soft tissues around the vertebrae will just slowly nudge the bones back into the shape they held before. Here, says the soft tissues, here is where we live, not in that strange and sudden change. Something similar happens with reform approaches to social change. Often the reform brings about fresh air for, if you're lucky, the space of a generation who fought for it. But then over time, the reform flattens, and the harm that it was intended to shift shape changes back. Our work with the Healing Histories Project is all about naming a 500-year history of care, showing how this or that reform has done some things, but mostly after a generation or two, the original violence starts shaping the present again. So, part of the reason that I pull that, and so many good reasons, but one of the main ones is that piece around culture and what we're experiencing right now in terms of coming to, again, potentially face the harm and violence that we have been kind of walking on for the last couple hundred years. Like, it requires a cultural shift, not a political one. And it's pretty difficult for us to make that kind of move if the thing that we're focused on is electoral politics. Now, that isn't to say that we should never focus on electoral politics, right? That's not the game. But it is to say that the cultural work and the cultural workers who are out there really doing some amazing cultural organizing are the ones inside of our political body that are going to be the ones who help that soft tissue change. So Ta-Nehisi Coates is a fave of mine, and I don't know that he would identify as a cultural worker, but I'm putting him in there. And, part of the argument that he's making right now is that there's a fundamental opposition to apartheid that he is willing to just say out loud and say really consistently. And he's like, and I'm against it everywhere it goes. And I got to hear him talk here in New Orleans a few weeks ago. He was here through Baldwin and Company, one of our lovely local Black bookstores. Shout out to DJ. And the thing that he said when he got this question around the election, and the thing that he said was, I'm not looking at the folks across the aisle or across the way or across town who voted this way or that way. He's like, I'm looking at the handful of dudes, mostly old white dudes, who didn't do what was necessary to prevent them from happening in the first place, right? And so I think there's a thing that we have to keep practicing, which is to continue to hold a structural analysis of the conditions that we are facing. And at the same time, to hold individuals inside of that structure responsible. So when I think about it as what is the kind of threat to the collective body or to the political body, to the structural body, what's the threat response, and how are we getting kind of stuck or not stuck around that? I think the point that Leslie made is brilliant, right? It's there was a freeze for at least part of this kind of political body, structural body, which means that there has to be a thaw. There has to be a time and a place where folks can begin to move again. But when I think about it in terms of this particular moment, in this particular country, in this particular history, this is much more of a continuation than it is an aberration. And if this is a continuation, right, if this is a continuation of persistently traumatic conditions, then the big kind of structural realignment, right, the big bone setting isn't going to be enough for us to get right with what will actually be whatever is coming next. And when I say be with whatever is coming next, I mean be in a future that is toward life, right? There has to be a soft tissue. There has to be a cultural shift that is also about moving us toward life. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll talk about healing more later, but there's just that piece, right? Of it is, I think, both. I don't want to lose sight of those two things. I don't want to lose sight of the soft tissue adjustments as well as the structural adjustments, right? I don't want to lose sight of the structural pieces and the cultural pieces. And I don't want to lose sight of the, who's actually responsible for some of these things. Because there were a handful of old white dudes, most of whom we could all name, right? Those of us who follow the news, who could have made different decisions to prevent this really horrible outcome from happening, right? Could have just been nah, you don't get to run for office again after you have an insurrection. We had that shit on the books. It could have just been yeah, bet, true. you don't get to do that. But that's not what happened, right? So I don't want us to lose sight of a structural analysis that includes individuals who are in positions of power and the responsibility that they hold to the rest of the collective body.
Right. I think you could even take it a step further and say that those people that had such an outsized amount of power in our political system, choosing against the rule of law, choosing against the will of the people, and many times to install someone who, I will just go on the record as saying is completely and wholly unfit and is, going to run an authoritarian government. That's a systemic trauma, right? Like the history will not be kind to several people. And I don't want to go deep into the deep end of like naming names here, but there are people who at multiple times in multiple ways interrupted systems that were supposed to, provide for the care and protection of the collective, specifically in keeping somebody who's so wholly unfit out of office after they had, fomented an insurrection. So in this whole conversation around overwhelm, one of the things that at least I noticed was happening for myself was I was really searching for distraction. I was really, really like, give me some deep end distraction. And honestly, y'all, that's just like a super common trauma response. Like, and I think the medicine here is pay attention to what kind of distractions, pay attention to what you reach for when you are wanting that distraction. Just a compulsory cautionary note about social media and its impact on our mental wellness. I'll just leave that as it is. But one of the things that you can choose to be distracted with is stories of what else is possible. One of the first things I started doing after the election was rewatching the really, really incredibly wonderful, do highly recommend Star Wars series Andor. Now, I wouldn't say this about any other Star Wars series, but Andor is a particularly standout piece of television.
We could have a different podcast about how I'm down for Ahsoka all day, but go ahead.
Right. Well, no, Ahsoka was great, but in the spirit of like fomenting, yeah.
I feel like,
okay,
go ahead. Do you think? Yeah. Go ahead.
Rebuilding books. Like there's a few very wise people that I, have on autoplay on my Audible. And so what you choose to be distracted with in moments where you choose that, what you choose to give your attention to which is a very, very precious resource, really matters, I think, in times like this. The neurons that fire together wire together. So if when you choose to self-soothe or self-regulate, you're going to things that are nourishing, to things that like give you a sense of possibility, things that, bring you joy if that's possible for you, or at least bring you some amount of comfort. That is going to overall be healthier, right? More trauma-informed than things that are just feeding the beast, feeding the spiral, feeding the hate, or making ourselves feel more isolated, right? The answer is more safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, not less. So I'll end with that note on, seek inspiration. The thing about a rebellion, the thing about resistance is that like you need tactics, you also need a vision of what else is possible. And I really feel like the political left has suffered from a lack of vision of what else is possible. And we need to collectively vision that. And one of the things that I really hope for with the framework is that it helps us see what collective healing can look like, what transformative justice at the systems level can look like. But we all need to vision it in order for us to make it manifest. We really need to spend some time imagining what it could be like. So overwhelm is overwhelm, and how we pull ourselves out of it has a lot to do with where we put our focus and attention.
So just like a quick summary, right? So we got to talk about the body, brain, behavior piece, right? And so the reminder that our body, brain is a unit. We experience that in a kind of unified way, that it's not this separate entity where we've got our brain on one hand and our body on the other hand. I spent a lot of time with Descartes when I was in college. So anybody who wants to come and get me with some, I think therefore I am, or some, we can hang out there. But that we talk about body brain behavior because we can see the way that trauma shows up in each of these, and we can find healing in any one of them, right? So any one of those doors is great. What we find is that we see behavior first because we can't see into the brain. So we experience behavior often before we experience the kind of the brain side of what a trauma reaction or trauma response is. So when we're thinking about what we're observing, how we're supporting people, how we're supporting ourselves, how we're tending to our own self, again, kind of any of those doors is great. And sometimes the behavior is the one that's most evident. That our nervous system is always, 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 always being tuned to best survive its environment. So it's tuning into how to survive persistently traumatic conditions. If you are in places that are exacerbating those traumatic conditions, that is what your nervous system will continue to tune for. To the best of our ability to practice placing ourselves in relationships and in groups and that are supportive to our safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, right? So, and then our nervous system will tune to that, right? We'll orient toward that as an expectation. We'll get better and better and better at noticing when we are experiencing those things and how those things are restoring our sense of belonging, safety, dignity, and agency. And now a practice. So I want to invite us into a practice. Again, this is a breath practice, as Leslie was saying earlier. It is our primary way of interacting with our nervous system in a way that we can thoughtfully exercise some amount of control over. I also like to think of our breath as our constant companion, right? So there, from the moment that we take our first breath until the moment that we take our last breath. If you are operating heavy machinery, including vehicles, this is a good practice to do when you are not doing those things. And it's a two-part practice. The first part of the practice is actually going to invite you in to a little bit of hyperventilation. So again, hyper, right? Above, upper, over. And the purpose of that is to actually get a little taste of what happens and what's happening when we're in that activated state. So when you're ready, you're going to breathe into the upper part of your chest, the upper part of your torso, really feeling your lungs expand up and out to the sides. So you can even put your hands or your arms on the sides of your rib cage and feel your lungs expanding up and out. And we're just going to breathe relatively quickly for, 10 or 15 breaths. It can be either in through your nose or in through your mouth. Doesn't matter. And begin. And stop. And let it out. And you can do a quick scan. Just notice your thoughts, your sensations, any emotions. I noticed the stuttering that happens in my breath when I do that, and it takes me right back to like crying as a kid, where I had like those big, good, ugly cries, where like, right, like that feeling, and a desire to not hang out there. Like, that's enough, thanks. And then for the second part, we're going to breathe deep into our belly. So we'll breathe out first. So just a nice cleansing out breath through your mouth. And a deep breath into your belly, as low in your belly as you can. We'll take 4 or 5 of these big, slow, deep breaths. And similarly, notice emotions, sensations, intellections. I notice that every time I breathe out, my shoulders drop a little bit more. So 2 more big breaths into the belly. And out. Last one, possibly with something else that your body wants to do. Mine really wants to stretch into the belly. And out. What I love about this practice is it's simple, it's available, and it gives us both a sense of what is that up activation feeling and what is a down deactivation feeling. And knowing that we can kind of have either of those whenever we'd like. So thanks for listening. Thanks to our listeners. What is it? Rate and review, do all the things. Shout out to Has Everything & Co. Shout out to The Land. Shout out to Nast Studios.
Thanks all. Take good care of yourselves. Take care of your loved ones. We're finally getting better at this, Teddy. Hallelujah.
Thanks, Leslie.